Sheriff Jake Morrison's question hung in the Arizona heat as the woman calling herself Mrs. Chen, the town's skilled midwife, realized her 3 months of hiding were over. Because Jake had recognized her. Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, runaway daughter of a corrupt San Francisco banker, a woman with a $5,000 bounty on her head and secrets that could destroy her father's criminal empire. She'd come to Copper Ridge to disappear. Instead, she found 30 people dying from deliberate arsenic poisoning, a conspiracy involving the same corrupt judge she'd been running from. Now Elizabeth faces an impossible choice: stay hidden while people or reveal her identity, and risk at everything to expose the truth. This is the story of a frontier doctor who chose to fight back. And if you love intelligent heroines who refuse to be silenced, hit that like button, because Elizabeth Hartford is done running. You're not just a midwife, are you? Sheriff discovers Doctor hiding deadly family. Secret: the Arizona sun beat down on Copper Ridge with the kind of merciless heat that turned the earth to dust and made mirages dance on the horizon. Elizabeth Hartford stood in the doorway of her small adobe clinic, watching a dust devil spin itself into existence at the edge of town, and wondered not for the first time if running this far had been far enough. She'd stopped being Elizabeth Hartford 3 months ago. Now she was Mrs. Sarah Chen, widow of a Chinese railroad worker who'd never existed, herbalist and midwife to a mining town that asked few questions about a woman's past as long as she could deliver babies and set broken bones without flinching. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth every time she spoke it. But ash was better than the alternative: being dragged back to San Francisco, back to her father's marble mansion, back to Judge Marcus Whitmore, and a marriage that would be nothing more than a gilded cage with locked doors and her father's reputation as the key. Mrs. Chen, a small voice interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth turned to find Emma Robertson, hovering at the edge of the doorway, all gangly limbs and copper hair that refused to stay braided. 10 years old, motherless since birth, living with a rotating cast of reluctant relatives who saw her as burden rather than blessing. The girl had attached herself to Elizabeth within days of her arrival in Copper Ridge, drawn by something neither of them could name but both understood. Loneliness, recognized loneliness even across decades of difference. "Come in, sweetheart." Elizabeth stepped aside, letting the girl escape the oppressive heat. "Did Mrs. Patterson send you away again?" Emma nodded, her gray eyes downcast. "Said I was underfoot. Said she's got her own children to mind without adding orphans to the count." The casual cruelty of it made Elizabeth's chest tighten. She knew what it felt like to be unwanted by the people who should have loved you most. Her father had made that clear every time he'd dismissed her medical ambitions as unsuitable for a woman of quality, every time he'd chosen business over her company, every time he'd made it clear she was valuable only as a matrimonial pawn to cement his banking empire's alliances. "Well, you're not underfoot here." Elizabeth guided Emma to the small table where she prepared her medicines. "In fact, I could use an assistant today. Mrs. Kowalski is due any day now, and I need to prepare supplies." The transformation in Emma's face was instantaneous, shoulders straightening, chin lifting, eyes brightening with purpose. "What should I do?" "Clean those instruments in the boiling water, then dry them carefully and wrap them in clean cloth." Elizabeth gestured to the array of surgical tools she kept hidden beneath herbalist supplies. "And Emma, what you see here stays here. Some of these tools, people might not understand why a simple midwife would have them." The girl's eyes widened as she took in the scalpels, forceps, and surgical clamps that belonged in a physician's bag, not a folk healer's collection. "You're not really just a midwife, are you, Mrs. Chen?" Elizabeth's hand stilled over the lavender she'd been crushing. "Why would you say that?" "Because you talk different sometimes when you think I'm not listening." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment. "You use big words, medical words. And your hands, they're soft, not like the other women here who've been washing clothes and scrubbing floors their whole lives." Smart girl. Too smart for her own good, perhaps. Elizabeth met those knowing gray eyes and made a decision. "Can you keep a secret, Emma? A real secret, the kind that could get me in serious trouble if the wrong people found out." The girl nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what was being offered. Trust was a rare commodity in Copper Ridge, rarer still for a woman alone and a child unwanted. "My name isn't really Sarah Chen." Elizabeth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, even though they were alone. "I was trained as a physician in San Francisco. But there are people looking for me, powerful people who want to force me into a life I don't want. So I came here and I became someone else. Why would anyone force you to do something you don't want? Emma May's face scrunched with confusion. You're a grown woman. Can't you just say no? The innocence of the question nearly broke Elizabeth's heart. When you're a woman, Emma May, sometimes no isn't enough, especially when the men making demands have money power and the law on their side. That's not fair. No, it's not. Elizabeth returned to crushing lavender, the familiar rhythm soothing her racing thoughts. But fairness isn't something we can always count on. What we can count on is being smart, being prepared, and knowing when to hide and when to fight. Which are you doing now? Hiding or fighting? Both. I'm hiding here, but I'm fighting to keep the skills I worked so hard to learn. Every baby I deliver, every broken bone I set, every fever I treat, that's me fighting to be the doctor I trained to be, even if I can't use the title. Emma May absorbed this in silence, her small hands carefully washing instruments with the precision Elizabeth had taught her. Finally, she asked, "Can you teach me to be a doctor like you?" It's not an easy path. People will tell you it's impossible, that women aren't meant to be physicians. People tell me lots of things are impossible. Emma May's jaw set with determination. They say orphans can't amount to anything. They say girls should be seen and not heard. They say I'm too much trouble. She looked up, meeting Elizabeth's eyes with fierce conviction. But you're here and you're a doctor, even if you have to pretend you are not. That means it's possible. So yes, I want you to teach me. Elizabeth felt something crack open in her chest, the wall she'd built around her heart since fleeing San Francisco, the isolation she'd wrapped around herself like armor. This child, unwanted and underestimated, saw her clearly and chose her anyway. All right, Elizabeth said softly. I'll teach you, but Emma May, if anyone asks, you're teaching me to be a midwife's assistant. I know. The girl smiled, quick and bright. I'm good at secrets, Mrs. Chen. I've had to be. They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing supplies, organizing medicines, creating order from the chaos of healing. Elizabeth found herself explaining as they worked the properties of different herbs, the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, the basic anatomy she'd memorized in medical school, while male students whispered that women's delicate constitutions couldn't handle such knowledge. She was so absorbed in teaching that she didn't hear the footsteps on the wooden boards outside until a shadow fell across the doorway. Mrs. Chen, the voice was male, Western drawled, carrying the kind of authority that made people straighten their spines instinctively. Elizabeth looked up to find Sheriff Jake Morrison filling her doorway, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Everything about him suggested danger. Not the immediate violence of her father's business associates or the cold cruelty of Judge Whitmore, but something more subtle. Jake Morrison was a man who noticed things the way his gray eyes cataloged every detail of her clinic, the instruments Emma May was wrapping, the medical texts Elizabeth kept hidden on a high shelf but hadn't hidden well enough. He was a man who asked questions and waited patiently for answers. Elizabeth had been avoiding him for 3 months. Apparently her luck had run out. Sheriff Morrison. She kept her voice level, tinged with the faint accent she'd adopted as part of her disguise. Is there something I can help you with? Got a man down at the Silver Star Mine. Cave in. Jake's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp. Rock crushed his leg pretty bad. Doc Jensen's gone to Tucson for supplies, won't be back for 3 days. You're the closest thing we've got to medical help. Elizabeth's mind raced through protocols, through the careful balance she'd maintained between helping enough to be useful and revealing too much of her training. A crushed leg could mean anything from simple fractures to compound breaks, arterial damage, crush syndrome. She was already reaching for her medical bag before she remembered to hesitate. Sheriff, I'm just a midwife. I help with births and minor injuries, but a crushed leg is going to cost Tommy Sullivan his life if someone doesn't help him in the next hour. Jake's voice remained even, but something flickered in his eyes. Challenge, perhaps, or testing. Now you can come with me and do what you can with your herbs and poultices, or you can tell me straight that you're more than a simple midwife and actually save this man's leg. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Emma May had frozen her eyes wide, looking between Elizabeth and the sheriff, like watching a chess match where she didn't know all the rules. Elizabeth could refuse. Could maintain her disguise, send him away. Let Tommy Sullivan take his chances with whatever rough aid the miners could provide. It would be safer. But she'd become a doctor because she couldn't stand by and watch people suffer when she had the skills to help. 3 months of hiding hadn't changed that fundamental truth about who she was. Emma may get my surgical kit, the real one in the locked cabinet. Elizabeth moved to gather supplies, her movements efficient and professional. Sheriff Morrison, I'll need clean water whiskey for sterilization and strong men to hold the patient down. This is going to hurt him considerably. Jake's expression didn't change, but something like satisfaction crossed his face. Yes, ma'am, I'll have everything ready. As he turned to leave, Elizabeth called out, Sheriff, how did you know? He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with those knowing gray eyes. A man doesn't spend 15 years as a Pinkerton detective without learning to see through disguises, Mrs. Chen. Or should I call you by your real name? Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Jake's voice was quiet, not unkind. But right now, Tommy Sullivan is more important than your secrets. We'll talk after if he survives. He left his bootsteps fading into the dusty street. Emma May stared at Elizabeth with wide eyes. He knows. Apparently. Elizabeth forced her hands to stop shaking as she gathered instruments. Which means we have very little time before everything falls apart. What are you going to do? Save Tommy Sullivan's leg. After that, Elizabeth looked at the girl who'd become her unexpected apprentice, her almost daughter, the first person to care about her in months. After that, we'll see if Sheriff Morrison is the kind of man who turns in a woman trying to escape an arranged marriage, or the kind who asks questions first. What if he's the first kind? Elizabeth thought of her father's mansion in San Francisco, of Judge Whitmore's cold smile, and colder hands of a future where her medical degree would gather dust while she hosted dinner parties and produced heirs and slowly suffocated under the weight of other people's expectations. Then I run again, she said simply, but not before I save that miner's life. Some things are more important than staying hidden. Emma May nodded solemn beyond her years. I'll help. You'll observe. Elizabeth softened her tone. This is going to be difficult, Emma May. There will be blood screaming, possibly amputation if the damage is too severe. Are you sure you want to see that? You said being a doctor wasn't easy. I need to know what that means. The girl's courage humbled her. All right, but if it becomes too much, you leave immediately. No shame in that. They gathered supplies and hurried through the dusty streets toward the Silver Star mine. Elizabeth's mind was already shifting into the clinical detachment she'd learned in medical school, assess the injury-determined viability of the limb, prepare for multiple scenarios including worst case. She didn't let herself think about what would happen after when Jake Morrison would inevitably ask questions she couldn't safely answer. One crisis at a time. The mine entrance was chaos, men covered in rock dust, voices raised in panic, and at the center of it all, Tommy Sullivan lying on a makeshift stretcher, his right leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath a blood-stained blanket. Elizabeth pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who'd navigated hospital emergency rooms and learned that hesitation costs lives. Clear a space, I need good light and room to work. The miners parted automatically, responding to command in her voice. Jake had already prepared a flat area near the mine office, clean blankets spread across a table that would serve as an operating surface. Water boiled over a makeshift fire, and several bottles of whiskey stood ready. Professional, efficient. The preparations of someone who'd seen battlefield medicine and understood what a surgeon needed. More questions for later, if there was a later. Elizabeth moved to Tommy's side, her hands already assessing the injury through gentle palpation. The miner was semi-conscious, shock settling in his breathing, shallow and rapid. Not good, but workable. Tommy, I'm Mrs. Chen. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay as still as possible. She kept her voice calm, professional. Can you feel your toes? A weak nod. Good. Nerve function intact. That improved his chances considerably. She pulled back the blanket and assessed the damage with clinical precision. Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, significant soft tissue damage, but the bone hadn't severed the femoral artery. If it had, he'd already be dead. Emma, may I need you to write down everything I say? Can you do that? Elizabeth glanced at her young assistant, who stood pale but determined at the edge of the workspace. The girl nodded, producing the small notebook Elizabeth had given her for exactly these situations. Sheriff Morrison, I need 4 strong men to hold him down. This is going to hurt considerably, and he will fight us. Elizabeth began scrubbing her hands with carbolic soap, the familiar ritual centering her. And someone needs to get him drinking that whiskey. All of it, if possible. You're not going to amputate, one of the miners asked, his voice thick with fear for his friend. Not if I can help it. Elizabeth's hands moved with practiced efficiency, laying out instruments in precise order. But I need absolute stillness when I set the bone. Any movement could sever the artery or cause permanent nerve damage. She worked quickly, explaining each step to MMA in clear clinical terms. Cleaned the wound with carbolic solution, debrided damaged tissue, located the bone fragments, and began the delicate process of realignment. Tommy screamed, his body arching against the men holding him down, but Elizabeth's hands remained steady. She'd done this before in the charity hospital, where she'd completed her training in the emergency wards, where wounded laborers came bleeding and broken. This was who she really was, not a hiding widow or a disguised herbalist, but Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, physician trained and competent and willing to do whatever it took to save a life. 40 minutes later, Tommy's leg was set splinted and bandaged with professional precision. He'd passed out from pain and whiskey somewhere around the halfway point, which made the final stages significantly easier. Elizabeth stepped back, surveying her work with critical eyes. He needs to stay completely off that leg for at least 6 weeks. Someone will need to check the wound daily for signs of infection. If there's redness, heat, or unusual swelling, send for me immediately. The miners stared at her with something approaching awe. Ma'am, one of them said slowly, that was some of the finest medical work I've seen since the war. You sure you're just a midwife? Before Elizabeth could answer, Jake's voice cut through the murmurs. Mrs. Chen is whatever she needs to be to save lives. Right now, that's enough questions. His eyes met hers across Tommy's unconscious form. You did good work here. Real good work. Thank you, Sheriff. Elizabeth began cleaning her instruments, her hands moving automatically through familiar motions. MMA, can you help pack these supplies? The crowd dispersed gradually, miners returning to work or helping transport Tommy to more comfortable quarters. Soon it was just Elizabeth, MMA, and Jake Morrison in the fading afternoon light. We need to talk, Jake said quietly. I expect we do. Elizabeth continued packing her medical bag, using the task to avoid meeting his eyes. Though I'm not sure what there is to say, you clearly know I'm not who I claim to be. I know you're running from something. I know you've got medical training that goes way beyond midwifery. I know you're using a false name. Jake's voice remained even neutral. What I don't know is whether you're running from or from something else. Does it matter? Yeah, it matters. I'm the law in Copper Ridge, Mrs. Chen. If you've committed crimes, I haven't. Elizabeth finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I've broken no laws, Sheriff Morrison. I'm simply a woman trying to avoid a marriage I didn't consent to, arranged by a father who sees me as property rather than a person. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Your father is Charles Hartford, San Francisco banker, one of the richest men in California. It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth nodded anyway. No point in denying what he clearly already knew. And the marriage, Jake asked, to Judge Marcus Whitmore, 47 years old, twice widowed, with connections to every corrupt official and criminal enterprise between here and San Francisco. Elizabeth's voice hardened with barely controlled anger. My father arranged it to cement a business alliance. I was never consulted, never asked if I wanted to spend my life married to a man who sees women as decorative objects to be controlled. So you ran. So I ran. Elizabeth closed her medical bag with decisive clicks of the latches. I took my mother's maiden name, created a background that would be difficult to trace, and came as far from San Francisco as I could manage. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, Sheriff Morrison, then arrest me. But I won't apologize for choosing my own life over the one my father sold me into. MMA moved closer to Elizabeth, a gesture of solidarity that was both touching and heartbreaking. The girl understood what it meant to be powerless, to have your future decided by others. Jake studied them both, the elegant doctor pretending to be a simple widow, the unwanted orphan who'd found purpose in being seen and valued, and something shifted in his expression. "I'm not going to arrest you, Mrs. Chen." He tipped his hat back, revealing more of his weathered face. "But you should know that your father has put out word through every Pinkerton office west of the Mississippi. $5,000 reward for information leading to your safe return." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. $5,000. That's a lot of money in a mining town where men work for $2 a day. Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "Sooner or later, someone's going to recognize you, make the connection, send a telegram. And when that happens, your father's people will come for you. Then I'll run again. Or how far can you get before the money catches up with you?" Jake stepped closer, his presence imposing but not threatening. "I've spent 15 years tracking people for Pinkerton. I know how these hunts work. Your father has resources you can't outrun, connections you can't hide from. Eventually he'll find you." "What are you suggesting?" Elizabeth's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "That I give up, go back to San Francisco, and let my father sell me to Judge Whitmore like a prize mare. I'm suggesting that maybe running isn't your only option." Jake glanced at MMA, then back to Elizabeth. "I'm suggesting that maybe you need allies instead of isolation." "Why would you help me? The reward alone. I don't work for Pinkerton anymore. Haven't for 3 years. Something dark crossed Jake's face, old pain briefly visible. "I came to Copper Ridge to get away from bounty hunting and tracking people who didn't want to be found. I became sheriff because this town needed someone who'd protect people instead of exploiting them." "That still doesn't explain why you'd risk helping me." Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. 3 years ago, my wife and daughter died of typhoid fever. I was tracking a fugitive for Pinkerton, thought I had time to get home before they got too sick. I was wrong." His voice roughened with old grief. "My wife begged me to stay, told me something was wrong, but I thought the job was more important. By the time I got back, they were both gone." Elizabeth's chest tightened with understanding and sympathy. "I'm sorry. After they died, I kept working for Pinkerton. Told myself it was just a job, that tracking people was honest work. Then one day I brought in a young woman who'd run away from a violent husband. Pinkerton paid me, her husband took her home, and 3 months later I read in the newspaper that she'd accidentally fallen down the stairs and broken her neck." Jake's jaw clenched. "That was the day I realized I'd been helping predators hunt their prey. So I quit, came here, and swore I'd never again turn in someone running from abuse." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. 3 people who'd all lost something to circumstances beyond their control, all trying to build new lives from the wreckage of their pasts. "So what do we do?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "If my father's put out a reward, if people will eventually recognize me, how do I stay hidden?" "You stop hiding quite so hard." Jake's expression turned thoughtful. "Right now you're a mysterious widow who appeared out of nowhere with skills that don't match your story. That makes people curious, makes them ask questions. But if you were simply the skilled midwife who saved Tommy Sullivan's leg, who helps the town doctor when he's away, who teaches an orphan girl the healing arts, that's a story people understand. That's someone they'll protect instead of exploit. You're suggesting I become more visible. I'm suggesting you become part of this community instead of a stranger passing through it." Jake turned to MMA. "And I'm suggesting this young lady here might need a legal guardian. Someone to make sure she's got a real home instead of being passed around to relatives who don't want her." MMA's eyes went wide. "You mean Mrs. Chen could adopt me?" "Copper Ridge doesn't have much in the way of formal adoption procedures. If a responsible adult wants to take in an orphan, generally the territorial authorities are just grateful someone's willing." Jake's voice softened. "And having a daughter would make Mrs. Chen's story more believable. Widow traveling with her late husband's child from a previous marriage. That explains why you're here, gives you roots, makes you real instead of mysterious." Elizabeth looked at MMA, at the hope blazing in those gray eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost, her name, her medical career, her freedom, that she hadn't considered what she might gain. A daughter. Not by blood, but by choice. A life that was hers, built on truth instead of deception. A purpose beyond simple survival. "MMA," Elizabeth said slowly, "would you want that?" "To be my daughter officially, yes." The word came out fierce and certain. Yes, please. Then we'll need to file paperwork, make it legal and proper. Elizabeth turned to Jake. And Sheriff Morrison, thank you for your discretion, your advice, and your help. Call me Jake. And Mrs. Chen, he tipped his hat. You might want to start thinking about what name you'll use on those adoption papers. Sarah Chen works for day-to-day, but legal documents require more authenticity. Elizabeth understood what he was really asking. How much truth was she willing to reveal? How far was she willing to come out of hiding to build this new life? Sarah Elizabeth Chen, she decided. Close enough to honest without being completely transparent. Jake nodded approval. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow. In the meantime, you should know there's been some concerning activity around the territory. Telegrams about missing women, questions about new arrivals. Your father's not the only one looking for someone. What do you mean? I mean there are patterns I don't like. Women disappearing gangs, asking questions about specific individuals, money changing hands in ways that suggest someone's buying information. Jake's expression turned grim. I don't know if it's connected to your situation, but I'm not a man who believes in coincidences. And you think my father hired people to search for me? I think your father has resources and connections that go beyond simple reward notices, and I think we need to be smart about protecting you until we understand what we're really dealing with. Jake paused. There's something else you should know about Judge Whitmore. Elizabeth's stomach clenched. What about him? I still have contacts in Pinkerton. One of them sent a telegram last week. Whitmore's been seen in territorial Arizona, supposedly on judicial business. But there's no official record of any cases he's presiding over here. You think he's looking for me personally? I think it's suspicious that your intended husband shows up in Arizona territory just as you're establishing yourself in a mining town. Could be coincidence. Jake's eyes hardened. But like I said, I don't believe in coincidences. Fear clawed at Elizabeth's throat, the same fear that had driven her from San Francisco 3 months ago. If Whitmore finds me, then we make sure he doesn't. Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. Copper Ridge protects its own Mrs. Chen. You saved Tommy Sullivan's leg today. That matters to people here. They're not going to hand you over to some rich judge from San Francisco without a fight. I can't ask people to risk themselves for me. You're not asking. I'm telling you how it is. Jake turned to go, then paused. One more thing. I've been investigating the Hartford banking syndicate for about 6 months now. Off the books, personal interest. Elizabeth's head snapped up. Why? Because I've got reason to believe your father's bank is financing criminal enterprises across the Western Territories. Cattle rustling, claim jumping protection rackets, all funded through legitimate-looking loans and investments. Jake's expression was carefully neutral. If I'm right, Charles Hartford is a lot more than just a banker who arranged an unwanted marriage for his daughter. The world tilted slightly beneath Elizabeth's feet. You're saying my father is a criminal. I'm saying I have suspicions that need proof, and I'm wondering if you might have information that could help me build a case. Jake met her eyes directly. Did you ever see documents in your father's house, letters, ledgers, anything that seemed out of place for a legitimate banker? Elizabeth's mind raced back to her father's study to late nights when she'd brought him coffee and seen papers spread across his desk. Papers he'd always hurriedly covered when she entered, as though hiding something he didn't want her to see. Maybe, she said slowly. I never paid much attention. I was too busy trying to avoid his notice and pursue my medical studies. But there were nights when men would visit men who didn't look like bankers or legitimate businessmen. My father would dismiss the household staff, take them into his study, and they'd talk for hours behind locked doors. Do you remember any names, faces? One man came regularly, red-haired with a scar across his left cheek. My father called him Owen. Elizabeth's brow furrowed with concentration. I heard them arguing once about something to do with railroad shipments and territorial claims. My father was angry, said Owen was being too visible, drawing too much attention. Jake's expression sharpened. Owen, red hair, scarred face. That matches the description of Owen Garrett, leader of a gang that's been hitting railroad shipments across Arizona and New Mexico territories. We've never been able to prove who's financing their operations, but if you're saying my father might be funding outlaws? Elizabeth felt sick. Jake, if that's true, if he's involved in criminal activity, then he's not just trying to find me to force a marriage. He's trying to find me because I might know things that could destroy him, which makes you considerably more dangerous to him than just a runaway daughter. Jake's voice turned grim, and considerably more valuable as a bargaining chip to Judge Whitmore. Emma May, who'd been listening with wide eyes, spoke up quietly. So, Mrs. Chen, and I mean my mother, she's in more danger than we thought. Yes, Jake said simply, which is why we're going to be very careful, very smart, and very prepared for whatever comes next. Elizabeth looked at the girl who would become her daughter and at the sheriff who'd chosen to help instead of exploit, at the dusty mining town that had become her refuge. 3 months ago, she'd arrived in Copper Ridge with nothing but a medical bag, a false name, and desperation to escape. Now she had people who cared about her, a purpose beyond simple survival, and the dangerous knowledge that her father's corruption went far deeper than she'd ever imagined. The question was whether that knowledge would save her or destroy her. What do we do now? Elizabeth asked. Now we prepare. Jake's expression was resolute. We make you indispensable to this community. We formalize your relationship with Emma May, and we gather evidence about your father's criminal activities. If he comes for you, we make sure we have enough ammunition to fight back legally instead of just running. And if Judge Whitmore comes first, then we deal with that too. Jake's hand rested on his gun, a gesture of protection rather than threat. But Mrs. Chen, Elizabeth, you need to understand something. If we're going to fight this battle, I need to know everything. Your father's business associates, Judge Whitmore's connections, anything you saw or heard that might be relevant. Can you do that? Elizabeth thought of her father's study of papers quickly hidden and conversations conducted in whispers. She thought of Judge Whitmore's cold smile and the way he looked at her like she was property to be acquired. She thought of Emma May's fierce hug and the miner's gratitude and the feeling of using her medical skills to save a life instead of hiding them to save herself. Yes, she said firmly, I can do that, but Jake, I want something in return. What's that? I want to help with your investigation, not just as a source of information, but as an active participant. Elizabeth's voice carried the steel of someone who'd spent too long being passive in her own life. If my father is funding criminal enterprises, if Judge Whitmore is involved in corruption, then I want to be part of bringing them down. Not as a victim to be protected, but as someone who fights back. Jake studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this smart and careful. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures that get you captured or killed. Agreed. And Emma May stays out of danger entirely. Absolutely. Emma May made a sound of protest, but Elizabeth silenced her with a look. This is not negotiable, sweetheart. You're 10 years old. Your job is to learn, grow, and be safe, not to fight adult battles. The girl subsided, though her expression suggested this was a temporary concession rather than permanent acceptance. Jake turned to leave, then paused once more. Elizabeth, you did good work today with Tommy Sullivan. Real good work. Don't let fear make you forget that you're a skilled physician who saves lives. That matters more than whatever secrets you're carrying. After he left, Elizabeth and Emma May walked back to the clinic in thoughtful silence. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, and the evening air had cooled to something almost comfortable. Mrs. Chen, Emma May's voice was small. Are we really going to be a family, officially? We really are. Elizabeth put her arm around the girl's thin shoulders. If you're certain that's what you want. It's what I've wanted since the day I met you. Emma May leaned into the embrace. But Mrs. Chen, mother, what if your father does find you? What if he takes you away? Then I'll fight to come back to you. Elizabeth's voice was fierce with promise. Emma May, I've spent my whole life being what other people wanted me to be. Dutiful daughter, invisible woman, decorative ornament to enhance my father's status. Coming here, becoming your teacher, building this life, it's the first time I've been able to choose who I am. And who are you? Elizabeth looked at the clinic ahead, at the adobe walls that housed her medical supplies and her secrets at the town that had given her refuge and now offered her belonging. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, physician and healer. She spoke the words like a vow. I'm a woman who refuses to be sold into a marriage she didn't choose. I'm someone who will fight for the people she loves and the life she's building. And most importantly, I'm going to be your mother, not by birth, but by choice. Emma May's smile was bright enough to rival the sunset. I think that's the best kind of mother there is. They entered the clinic together and Elizabeth lit lamps against the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Adoption paperwork continued, investigation into her father's criminal activities, the ever-present threat of discovery. But tonight she had a daughter to teach a life to build, and the dangerous knowledge that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought through running and hiding. Sometimes they were fought by standing your ground using your skills and refusing to let fear dictate your future. Elizabeth Hartford was done running. Now she was going to fight back. End of Part 1, 6,000 words. Tiep, Part 2, 3, D. 11:48 a.m. The arsenic came quietly disguised as salvation. For 3 weeks after Tommy Sullivan's surgery, life in Copper Ridge settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Elizabeth formally filed adoption papers for Emma May using the name Sarah Elizabeth Chen and a carefully constructed backstory that Jake helped polish into something believable. The girl moved into Elizabeth's small house behind the clinic, transforming the spare room with surprising speed books stacked on shelves, drawings pinned to walls, the organized chaos of a child finally allowed to claim space as her own. The town accepted the arrangement without question. A widow adopting her late husband's orphan niece made perfect sense, and Emma May's obvious joy at having a real home softened even the hardest hearts. Elizabeth allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd actually escaped. Then people started getting sick. It began with the Kowalski family: Joseph, his wife Maria, and their 3 children. Stomach cramps, violent vomiting, diarrhea that left them weak and dehydrated. Elizabeth treated them with fluids and rest, assuming it was contaminated food or a stomach flu making its rounds. But when the Kowalskis recovered, the Chen family fell ill. Then the Sullivans, then half the miners at the Silver Star. Within a week, 30 people were sick with the same symptoms. Within 2 weeks, that number had doubled. Doc Jensen finally returned from Tucson, took one look at the pattern, and made his diagnosis. Cholera, has to be. We need to quarantine the sick, burn contaminated materials, pray it doesn't spread further. But Elizabeth, examining patient after patient in the makeshift hospital they'd established in the town hall, wasn't convinced. The symptoms were similar to cholera, yes, but something felt wrong. The progression was slower, more variable. Some patients recovered quickly, while others lingered in illness for weeks. And there was something else, a metallic taste in their mouths, a distinctive smell to their breath. She was treating Emma May's teacher, Mrs. Fletcher, when the pieces finally clicked into place. "Mrs. Fletcher, have you noticed anything unusual about the water lately?" Elizabeth asked as she checked the woman's pulse. "Any strange taste or color? Now that you mention it, it has tasted a bit bitter." Mrs. Fletcher's voice was weak but clear. "I thought maybe it was just because I've been feeling poorly." Elizabeth's mind raced through her medical training, through toxicology lectures she'd attended at the insistence of a professor who believed doctors should understand poisons as well as cures. Bitter taste, metallic smell, gastrointestinal symptoms that varied in severity, longer progression than typical cholera. "Emma May," she called to her daughter, who was helping organize supplies across the room, "I need you to do something very important. Take a clean bottle and collect water samples from the town, well, the mining company's water supply, and the creek that runs behind the Silver Star. Label each one carefully." The girl's eyes widened with understanding. "You think it's the water? I think it might be something in the water. Something that's not disease at all." Doc Jensen looked up from the patient he was treating. "Mrs. Chen, if this isn't cholera, then we've been treating it wrong, and we need to change our approach immediately." Elizabeth's voice carried absolute conviction. "Doc Jensen, have you treated arsenic poisoning before?" The old doctor's face went pale. "Arsenic, you think someone's poisoning the water supply?" "I think the symptoms match, and if I'm right, we need to test the water and find the source before more people get sick." Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the mention of poison. "Did I hear that right? You think this is arsenic poisoning?" "It's a theory. I need to test it." Elizabeth was already gathering supplies, chemicals from her medical kit, litmus paper, the basic tools of toxicology she'd learned to use in medical school. "Jake, who controls the water supply in Copper Ridge. The mining company owns the rights to the creek and the main well. They sell water to the town at a fixed rate." His expression darkened. Why would the mining company poison their own water? Maybe they wouldn't, but maybe someone else would. Elizabeth met his eyes across the crowded hospital. Someone who wanted to drive down property values or force the mining company to sell or create chaos for reasons we don't yet understand. The Owen gang, Jake said grimly. They've been quiet lately, too quiet. And I've heard rumors they're looking to expand their operations into mining towns, taking over claims from owners who can't afford to keep them running. If they're poisoning the water supply to sicken the workforce and drive down the value of the mines, then we're dealing with something a lot more calculated than random illness. Jake's hand moved to his gun instinctively, and a lot more dangerous. MMA returned with the water samples slightly breathless from running. I got them all, Mother. The well water looks clear, but the creek water has a funny color to it, kind of milky white. Elizabeth took the samples and began testing immediately, her hands moving with practiced precision through the chemical analysis. Doc Jensen watched with the fascination of someone seeing techniques he'd never learned, while Jake stood guard at the door, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The results confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions within an hour. Arsenic trioxide in significant concentrations, she announced, holding up a test tube where precipitate had formed in telltale patterns. The creek water is heavily contaminated. The well water shows traces, but lower levels, probably because it's fed by underground springs that aren't as affected yet. How is arsenic getting into the creek? Doc Jensen demanded. That's the question. Jake was already moving toward the door. I'm going to check the mining operations upstream. If someone's dumping arsenic compounds into the water supply, there'll be evidence. I'm coming with you, Elizabeth said immediately. The hell you are. If this is the Owen gang's doing, then you'll need someone who can identify arsenic compounds and understand how they're being introduced to the water. Elizabeth's voice brooked no argument. I'm a physician with toxicology training, Jake. You need my expertise. She's right, Doc Jensen said reluctantly. If this is deliberate poisoning, we need to understand the mechanism to stop it. Mrs. Chen's medical knowledge could be critical. Jake looked like he wanted to argue further, but the logic was undeniable. Fine. But we go armed, we stay alert, and at the first sign of danger, you do exactly what I tell you. Understood. Understood. MMA started to protest being left behind, but Elizabeth silenced her with a look that had become familiar over the past weeks, the look of a mother who would accept no argument. You stay here and help Doc Jensen, Elizabeth said firmly. Keep detailed records of every patient's symptoms, when they got sick, where they were getting their water. That information could be crucial. The girl subsided, though her expression suggested she was already planning how to make herself more indispensable to future investigations. Elizabeth and Jake rode out toward the Silver Star mine as the sun climbed toward noon, the desert heat already oppressive. They followed the creek upstream past the main mining operations and into the rocky terrain where smaller claims dotted the landscape. Tell me about the Owen gang, Elizabeth said as they rode. What do you know about their operations? Owen Garrett runs a sophisticated organization, not just random outlaws, but organized crime with clear objectives and careful planning. Jake's voice was grim. They hit railroad shipments, rustle cattle, intimidate homesteaders into selling land cheap. But lately they've been moving into more complex schemes, taking over mining claims, manipulating water rights, even getting involved in territorial politics. And you think my father is financing them? I know your father is financing them. I've tracked 3 different shipments of cash from Hartford banking syndicate accounts to associates of Owen Garrett. What I haven't been able to prove is whether your father knows what his money is funding, or if he's being used by people who've infiltrated his operation. Elizabeth thought of her father, cold calculating, always focused on expanding his empire. My father doesn't get used. If his money is going to Owen Garrett, it's because he's getting something in return. Like what? Control, influence, the ability to manipulate entire regions through economic pressure. Elizabeth's voice hardened with understanding. If Owen Garrett can drive down property values through violence and sabotage, my father can buy up land and mining claims for pennies on the dollar. Then when stability returns, those properties become enormously valuable. That's a pretty sophisticated scheme for a gang of outlaws. It's not the outlaws who are sophisticated, it's whoever's directing them. Elizabeth reined her horse to a stop, pointing ahead. Jake, look. Small canyon off the main creek, a series of wooden barrels sat arranged in deliberate rows. White powder dusted the ground around them, and a rough channel had been dug to direct runoff into the main water supply. Jake dismounted cautiously, his gun drawn. "Stay back until I make sure it's safe." Elizabeth ignored him, sliding from her horse and approaching the barrels with professional curiosity. She examined the white powder, the distinctive crystalline structure, the way it had been carefully positioned to leach into the water supply during rain or when barrels were deliberately tipped. Arsenic trioxide, industrial grade, probably sourced from mining operations, where it's used to extract gold from ore. She looked up at Jake, her expression grim. "This isn't accidental contamination. Someone deliberately positioned these barrels to poison the water supply over time. How long would this take to sicken an entire town?" "Weeks, maybe a month depending on rainfall and how much water people were consuming." Elizabeth's mind was already working through the implications. "It's actually a clever approach, slow enough that people wouldn't immediately connect the illness to poison, variable enough that it could be mistaken for a disease outbreak. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, half the town would be too sick to work. The mining operations would be failing, and properties could be bought up cheaply." Jake examined the site with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years investigating crimes. "There are tracks here, multiple horses, heavy cargo loads. This wasn't a one-time setup. Someone's been maintaining this operation, probably adding more arsenic periodically." "Can you tell how recent the activity was?" "Within the last few days." Jake's expression darkened. "Which means whoever's doing this might come back to check on their work. We need to—" The sound of approaching horses cut him off. Jake grabbed Elizabeth and pulled her behind the cover of large boulders, his hand over her mouth to silence any startled sound. They crouched together in the shadow, barely breathing, as three riders came into view. Elizabeth recognized the lead rider immediately, and her blood turned to ice. Judge Marcus Whitmore, dressed in expensive riding clothes, completely unsuited to the Arizona desert, surveyed the poisoning site with the satisfied expression of a man reviewing profitable investments. "The operation is proceeding exactly as planned," he said to his companions, rough men who were clearly Owen gang members rather than legitimate associates. "The town doctor has diagnosed cholera, which means they're treating symptoms rather than cause. By the time they figure out the truth, half of Copper Ridge will be too sick to resist when we move to acquire the mining claims." "And Hartford?" one of the gang members asked. "He's getting impatient with the timeline." "Hartford can wait. This operation requires precision." Whitmore's voice carried cold authority. "Once we control the water rights and the mining claims, we'll have leverage over every operation in this region. Hartford Banking will finance the consolidation, and we'll all profit handsomely." Elizabeth felt Jake tense beside his fury barely controlled. This was the confirmation they needed, not just that Owen gang was poisoning Copper Ridge, but that Judge Whitmore was directly involved and that her father was financing the entire operation. "What about the woman?" another gang member asked. "Hartford's daughter. You still planning to bring her back to San Francisco?" Whitmore's expression turned ugly. "Elizabeth Hartford is a loose end that needs to be tied up. She's seen too much, knows too much about her father's business operations. Marrying me was supposed to ensure her silence, but since she ran—" He shrugged. "Once we've secured these mining operations, I'll deal with Elizabeth personally. Hartford wants her returned alive, but accidents happen in remote territories." The casual way he discussed her murder made Elizabeth's stomach clench with terror and rage in equal measure. Jake's hand tightened on his gun, but Elizabeth grabbed his wrist, shaking her head urgently. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Starting a fight here would get them both killed and accomplish nothing. Whitmore and his men spent several minutes checking the poison barrels, adding more arsenic compounds, and discussing their timeline. Then they mounted up and rode off, leaving Elizabeth and Jake hidden behind the boulders. They waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before emerging from cover. "We need to get back to town," Jake said urgently. "We need to warn people, shut down the contaminated water supply, and arrest Whitmore before he realizes we know about his operation. On what charges, we have no proof that will hold up in court." Elizabeth was already thinking like the strategic mind she'd inherited from her father, much as she hated to admit it. "Whitmore is a district judge with connections throughout the territory. Our word against his won't be enough, especially since I'm a woman using a false identity, and you're a small-town sheriff investigating a powerful judge. Then what do you suggest? We gather evidence, real undeniable evidence that connects Whitmore to the poisoning, to the Owen gang, and to my father's financing. Elizabeth's voice hardened with determination. And we get that evidence to someone with enough authority to arrest a corrupt judge, territorial governor, federal marshal, someone who can't be intimidated or bought. That could take weeks. People are dying, Elizabeth. People are sick, not dying yet. Elizabeth met his eyes. Jake, I know it's not ideal, but we need to be smart about this. If we move too quickly, Whitmore will disappear. My father will cover his tracks, and the Owen gang will just relocate their operation to another town. We need to destroy the entire criminal network, not just stop one poisoning scheme. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. Fine, but we shut down this poisoning operation immediately. I don't care if it tips off Whitmore. I'm not letting more people get sick while we build a legal case. Agreed, Otanin. We destroy the arsenic postcards on the water supply and make sure everyone in town knows to boil water before drinking. Elizabeth was already planning the medical response. And I need to adjust treatment protocols. Arsenic poisoning requires different approaches than cholera. We've probably been making people worse with some of our interventions. They worked quickly, smashing the poison barrels and burying the contaminated soil, documenting the site with sketches and written descriptions that could serve as evidence later. Then they rode hard back to Copper Ridge, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The town hall hospital was more crowded than when they'd left. Doc Jensen looked exhausted, and MMA was moving between patients with the focused competence of someone much older than her 10 years. Mother, MMA ran to Elizabeth with relief clear on her young face. 3 more people got sick while you were gone, and Mrs. Patterson's baby has been vomiting for 6 hours straight. I'm here now, sweetheart, and I know what's causing the illness. Elizabeth moved immediately into physician mode, her voice carrying across the crowded room. Everyone listen carefully. This is not cholera. It's arsenic poisoning from contaminated water. We need to shut down all use of creek water immediately and switch to well water only boiled before drinking. The room erupted in questions and protests, but Jake's authoritative voice cut through the chaos. You heard Mrs. Chen. This is an emergency health order backed by my authority as sheriff. Anyone found using creek water will be arrested for public endangerment. Doc Jensen pushed through the crowd to Elizabeth's side. Arsenic poisoning. You're certain? Absolutely certain. I tested the water myself and found the source industrial arsenic deliberately placed to contaminate the supply. Elizabeth was already pulling out medical texts, flipping to the sections on heavy metal poisoning. We need to adjust our treatment protocols immediately. Activated charcoal for recent exposures, chelating agents, if we can get them supportive care focused on protecting kidney function. I don't have chelating agents in Copper Ridge, Doc Jensen said grimly. Then we improvise. Egg whites can help bind some of the arsenic in the digestive tract. Milk thistle for liver protection. High fluid intake to help the kidneys process and eliminate the poison. Elizabeth's hands were already moving, organizing supplies, preparing treatments. MMA, I need you to make a list of every patient, how long they've been sick, and their primary symptoms. We need to identify who has the highest arsenic burden and prioritize treatment. The girl nodded and hurried off to follow instructions, her notebook already in hand. Jake stood at Elizabeth's side, his presence solid and reassuring. What do you need from me? Postguards on the well. Make sure no one contaminates it while we're dealing with this crisis. And Jake, she lowered her voice, Whitmore will know we've discovered his operation as soon as word spreads about the poisoning. We need to be ready for him to make a move. I'm already on it. I've got men watching the roads into town, and I've sent telegrams to the territorial marshal about a possible public health emergency. That should get us some official backup. His voice dropped even further. Elizabeth, when Whitmore comes, and he will come, you need to be somewhere safe, somewhere he can't find you. I'm not hiding while people are sick. I'm a Dr. Jake. This is what I do. You're also the woman he plans to murder once he's secured his criminal operation. Jake's hand found hers, the gesture brief but significant. Please, let me protect you. Elizabeth looked at him, really looked, and saw past the gruff sheriff exterior to the man beneath. The widower who'd lost his family and blamed himself. The former Pinkerton agent who'd quit rather than continue hunting vulnerable people. The protector who'd chosen to help her instead of exploiting her for reward money. Somewhere over the past weeks, she'd started to trust him. More than trust, she'd started to care about him in ways that went beyond gratitude or alliance. "I'll be careful," she promised, "but I won't hide. Not anymore." Jake looked like he wanted to argue further, but a commotion at the entrance interrupted them. Tommy Sullivan burst into the town hall, his healing leg causing him to limp, but not stopping his momentum. "Sheriff Judge Whitmore just rode into town with 6 men. They're at the mayor's office right now demanding to speak with you about public health management and territorial authority." Elizabeth and Jake exchanged loaded glances. "He's making his move," Jake said grimly, "probably planning to use the poisoning crisis as an excuse to take control of the town, declare martial law, or some legal maneuver that gives him authority." "Can he do that?" "If he's a territorial judge with the right paperwork and no one to challenge him, yeah. He can do pretty much whatever he wants." Jake's jaw clenched. "Unless we expose him first. We don't have enough evidence yet. We have testimony about what we overheard at the poisoning site. We have the physical evidence of the arsenic barrels. We have a town full of sick people." Jake turned to Doc Jensen. "Doc, would you be willing to testify that this illness pattern is consistent with deliberate poisoning rather than natural disease outbreak?" The old doctor straightened his shoulders. "Damn right I would. No one poisons my patients and gets away with that." "Then we make our stand now." Jake looked at Elizabeth. "I need you to prepare a formal medical report. Everything you found, how you tested the water, what the symptoms indicate. Make it professional, detailed, something that can't be easily dismissed." "That could take hours." "You've got 30 minutes before I have to go face Whitmore." Jake's voice was steel-wrapped in urgency. "MMA can help you. Doc Jensen can verify your findings. And when I walk into that mayor's office, I'm going to have enough evidence to accuse a territorial judge of mass poisoning and attempted murder." Elizabeth felt her heart racing with fear and determination in equal measure. This was it, the moment when hiding ended and fighting began. "MMA," she called. "Get my medical kit, my water testing equipment, and fresh paper. We're writing a report that's going to put a corrupt judge in prison." The girl's face lit up with fierce determination. "Yes, Mother." They worked with frantic efficiency, Elizabeth dictating findings while MMA wrote in her careful script, Doc Jensen verifying medical conclusions, Jake gathering physical evidence and witness statements. The hospital chaos continued around them, but Elizabeth forced herself to focus on precision and clarity. 28 minutes later, she handed Jake a 5-page report complete with chemical analysis, symptom documentation, and medical conclusions that definitively proved deliberate arsenic poisoning. "This is good work," Jake said, scanning the pages. "Professional, detailed, damning. A territorial judge is going to have a hard time dismissing this, especially when that judge is the one responsible for the poisoning." Elizabeth managed a grim smile. "Jake, be careful. Whitmore is dangerous, and he's got 6 armed men with him. I'm not going alone. I've got deputies, and I've got an entire town full of people who are angry about being poisoned." Jake paused at the door, looking back at her. "Elizabeth, if this goes badly, if Whitmore manages to arrest me or take control, you grab MMA and you run. You hear me? Don't try to fight him yourself. Promise me." Elizabeth looked at the man who'd protected her when he could have exploited her, who'd believed her when he could have dismissed her, who was about to risk everything to stop a corrupt judge from destroying an entire town. "I promise," she lied, knowing full well she had no intention of running if Jake was in danger. He studied her face, seemed to recognize the lie, but nodded anyway. Then he was gone, striding toward the mayor's office with the confidence of a man who'd decided that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Doc Jensen moved to Elizabeth's side. "He's a good man, stubborn but good. He's about to accuse a territorial judge of criminal conspiracy. That's beyond stubborn, it's potentially suicidal." Elizabeth's hands clenched with helpless fear. "And I can't do anything but wait and hope he survives." "You can prepare for casualties," Doc Jensen said practically. "If this turns into a shootout, we're going to have wounded, possibly dead. Better to be ready." He was right. Elizabeth forced her fear down and focused on what she could control, organizing medical supplies, preparing surgical instruments, briefing MMA on emergency protocols. They were halfway through preparations when gunfire erupted from the direction of the mayor's office. 3 shots, rapid fire. Then silence. Elizabeth's heart stopped. MMA grabbed her hand, both of them frozen in terror. Then more shots, a whole volley of them followed by shouting and the sound of breaking glass. "Stay here," Elizabeth ordered MMA, already grabbing her medical bag. "But you promised—" "I promised to run if things went badly. I didn't promise to abandon Jake if he's hurt." Elizabeth looked at Doc Jensen. "If I don't come back, you protect MMA. Get her out of town, send her to family in the East, anywhere that's safe from Whitmore and my father." Elizabeth. But she was already running toward the mayor's office, her medical bag clutched tight, her fear for Jake overriding every survival instinct she possessed. The scene she found was chaos. Jake stood in the middle of the street, his gun, smoking blood streaming from a wound on his left arm. 4 of Whitmore's men were down, 2 clearly dead, 2 wounded and disarmed. The remaining 2 had their hands raised in surrender, surrounded by armed townspeople who'd appeared at the first sound of gunfire. And Whitmore himself was on his knees in the dust. His expensive clothes ruined his face, twisted with rage and disbelief as Jake held a gun to his head. "Elizabeth I told you to stay at the hospital," Jake said without taking his eyes off Whitmore. "You're bleeding. You need medical attention." Elizabeth approached cautiously, assessing the situation. "What happened?" "Whitmore tried to have me arrested for interfering with territorial judicial authority. I presented evidence of the poisoning. He denied everything and ordered his men to take me into custody. When I refused," Jake gestured to the bodies in the street, "they drew first. I was just faster." "You can't do this," Whitmore snarled. "I'm a territorial judge. You have no authority to arrest me." "Actually, I have every authority to arrest someone who attempted to murder an entire town through deliberate poisoning." Jake's voice was cold. "And someone who ordered armed men to kill a lawfully appointed sheriff. That's conspiracy to commit murder, Judge Whitmore. Federal crime. You have no proof. We have a 5-page medical report documenting arsenic poisoning. We have physical evidence of the poisoning site. We have witness testimony from townspeople who got sick. And we have your own words overheard at the poisoning site discussing your operation with Owen gang members." Jake pressed the gun more firmly against Whitmore's head. "You want to keep claiming innocence, or you want to start talking about deals?" Whitmore's eyes found Elizabeth and his expression shifted to something venomous. This is your fault. If you'd just married me like you were supposed to, none of this would have been necessary. Your father and I could have consolidated our operations without all this messy violence." "So you admit you're working with my father," Elizabeth said, moving closer despite Jake's warning glance. "You admit the poisoning was deliberate." "Of course it was deliberate. How else were we supposed to acquire mining claims at reasonable prices?" Whitmore's rage was making him reckless. "Your father needed to expand his territorial holdings. I needed legitimate business interests to fund my political ambitions, and the Owen gang needed protected operations. Everyone benefits when we work together. Except the people you're poisoning, terrorizing, and murdering," Jake said flatly. "Collateral damage in pursuit of progress." Whitmore actually smiled, cold and cruel. "You think you've won, Sheriff Morrison? You think arresting me will stop anything? Charles Hartford has connections at every level of territorial and federal government. He'll have me released within a week, and you'll be the one facing charges: assault on a judicial officer, murder of deputized law enforcement, obstruction of territorial authority." "Those men weren't deputized law enforcement. They were Owen gang criminals." Jake looked at the gathered crowd. "Anyone here recognize these men as legitimate deputies?" A chorus of negative responses. Several people called out, "Those are Owen's boys. And I seen that one rustling cattle last spring." "So we've got you on conspiracy with known outlaws, attempted mass murder through poisoning, and ordering criminals to kill a sheriff." Jake's smile was grim. "Plus Elizabeth here is willing to testify about your plans to murder her once you'd secured these mining operations. That's a lot of federal crimes, Judge Whitmore." For the first time, genuine fear crossed Whitmore's face. "You can't prove any connection to Hartford. Even if I go down, he'll walk away clean." "Maybe, maybe not." Jake hauled Whitmore to his feet. "But right now you're going to jail, and I'm sending telegrams to every federal marshal between here and Washington about a corrupt territorial judge who tried to poison an entire mining town. As Jake led Whitmore away, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to breathe. They'd done it. They'd stopped the poisoning, exposed Whitmore's involvement, and survived the confrontation. But the victory felt hollow as she realized Jake was right in arresting Whitmore might not be enough to stop her father. Charles Hartford had spent decades building his criminal empire. One arrested judge wouldn't bring him down. She was still thinking about this when MMA ran up her face pale. "Mother, you need to come quickly. One of the wounded men he's asking for you specifically. Says he has information about your father." Elizabeth followed MMA back to the town hall where Doc Jensen was treating the two wounded Owen gang members under armed guard. One of them, a young man barely out of his teens, was bleeding from a shoulder wound and looked terrified. "You're Elizabeth Hartford?" he asked as she approached. "I am. My name's Billy Garrett, Owen Garrett's nephew." The young man's voice shook. "I need to tell you something about your father, something Owen told me before he sent me on this job." "What is it?" "Your father, Charles Hartford, he's not just financing Owen's operations. He's planning to eliminate anyone who knows too much about his criminal activities." Billy's eyes were wide with fear. "That includes Judge Whitmore, includes Owen himself, and especially includes you. Once this mining operation was secured, we were supposed to kill Whitmore and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Then we were supposed to find you and make sure you disappeared permanently." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "My father ordered my murder. He told Owen that you were too much of a liability, too smart, too independent, might figure out what he was doing and expose everything." Billy coughed, wincing with pain. "Ma'am, I'm telling you this because I got a little sister about your age. When Owen told me what we were supposed to do to you, I couldn't. I mean, I'm an outlaw, but I ain't no murderer of innocent women." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I can prove it." Billy fumbled in his shirt pocket, pulling out a folded telegram. Owen kept this as insurance, figured if Hartford tried to double-cross him, he'd have evidence. "It's from your father giving explicit orders about how to handle the Elizabeth situation once the mining claims were secured." Elizabeth took the telegram with shaking hands and read her father's words, cold clinical instructions for her elimination written in the same businesslike tone he'd use for any other transaction. "Terminate with extreme prejudice. Make it look accidental. No traces." Her father hadn't just arranged an unwanted marriage. He'd planned her murder. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Whitmore had done. She'd known her father was cold, ambitious, willing to sacrifice her happiness for his business interests. But this ordering her death like she was nothing more than a problematic business asset, this was something else entirely. "Elizabeth?" Jake's voice came from behind her. He'd returned from locking up Whitmore and immediately came to find her. "What's wrong?" She handed him the telegram, silently unable to speak past the grief and rage choking her throat. Jake read it, his expression darkening with every word. Then he pulled her close, his embrace fierce and protective. "I'm not going to let him hurt you. You understand me. Whatever it takes, however far we have to go, your father is not going to touch you." Elizabeth let herself lean into his strength for one moment, allowed herself to accept comfort instead of standing alone. Then she pulled back her spine, straightening with new resolve. "I want him destroyed," she said quietly. "Not just arrested or exposed, completely destroyed. I want every corrupt deal exposed, every criminal connection severed, every dollar of his ill-gotten fortune that's seized. I want Charles Hartford to lose everything the way he was willing to let me lose my life." "Then that's what we'll do." Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. "We'll gather every piece of evidence, testimony, documentation we can find. We'll build a case so solid that even Hartford's connections can't protect him. And I'm going to testify," Elizabeth added. "No more hiding behind false names. I'm Elizabeth Hartford, daughter of Charles Hartford, and I'm going to stand in federal court and detail every crime I've witnessed, every conversation I've overheard, every piece of his criminal empire that I've been forced to observe." Emma May appeared at Elizabeth's side, slipping her small hand into her mother's. "I'll help however I can." Elizabeth looked down at her daughter, this brave, fierce girl who'd chosen to stand with her despite the danger, and felt something settle into place. She'd spent months running, hiding, trying to escape her father's reach. No more. Now she was going to fight back with everything she had, her medical knowledge, her testimony, her refusal to be silenced or eliminated. Charles Hartford had made a critical mistake. He'd underestimated his daughter, assumed she was too weak or too frightened to stand against him. He was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. The telegram arrived at dawn 3 days after Judge Whitmore's arrest. Elizabeth was in the makeshift hospital checking on patients who were slowly recovering from arsenic poisoning when Jake appeared in the doorway with an expression that made her stomach clench with dread. "It's from the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson." He handed her the thin paper, his jaw tight. "They're sending someone to take custody of Whitmore and investigate the poisoning allegations." Elizabeth scanned the telegram, her medical training allowing her to parse the formal language quickly. Then she reached the signature line and her blood turned to ice. "Federal Marshal Thomas Hendricks. He's one of my father's men. I've seen him at dinner parties in San Francisco, taking money from Hartford banking syndicate accounts." She looked up at Jake, fear and fury warring in her chest. "My father's already making his move. He's sending someone to investigate who will actually cover everything up." "We expected this." Jake's voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "Your father has spent decades building connections. Of course he'd have marshals on his payroll." "So what do we do if Hendricks takes custody of Whitmore? All our evidence disappears. Billy Garrett's testimony gets dismissed. The poisoning gets blamed on natural contamination or accidental oversight." Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. "My father wins and we can't stop him. We don't let Hendricks take custody." Jake's tone carried absolute conviction. "We hold Whitmore here in Copper Ridge under local authority until we can get someone trustworthy, someone your father can't buy, to handle the investigation." "Jake, that's illegal, probably, dangerous, definitely." His smile was grim. "But I'm not handing over our only leverage to a corrupt marshal who'll make everything disappear. Not when we're this close to bringing down your father's entire operation." Emma May, who'd been folding bandages nearby with the focused concentration she brought to every task, spoke up quietly. "Mother, there's something else in that telegram. At the bottom." Elizabeth looked again and her heart sank further. Below the official notification was a personal message written in code so transparent it was clearly meant to be read, "E.H. Your father requests your immediate return to San Francisco to discuss family matters. Failure to comply will result in unpleasant consequences for your associates." A threat thinly veiled as familial concern. "He's going to hurt people here if I don't go back." Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's going to use Copper Ridge as leverage to force my surrender." "Let him try." Jake moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Elizabeth, your father's power comes from operating in shadows, from people being too afraid to fight back. The moment we expose him to federal authorities who aren't on his payroll, his whole empire crumbles. We just need to hold out long enough to make that happen." "And how do we find federal authorities he hasn't already corrupted?" "We go higher." Jake pulled another telegram from his pocket, this one already composed and ready to send. "I've got a contact in Washington, a congressman I saved from an assassination attempt back in my Pinkerton days. He owes me, and he's rabidly anti-corruption. If we can get evidence to him, he'll bring in marshals from the Capitol people who have no connection to Western territories or your father's network." Elizabeth read Jake's proposed telegram. Concise, urgent, detailing federal crimes and requesting immediate intervention. "Will he respond in time?" "He'll respond within 48 hours, I know him." Jake's expression turned thoughtful. "But Elizabeth, sending this telegram means going public with everything. Your real identity, your father's crimes, all of it. Once this goes out, there's no more hiding." "I'm done hiding." Elizabeth's voice carried steel. "Send the telegram, and Jake, I want to add something to it." She took the pencil from his hand and wrote in clear, precise script, "I, Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, daughter of Charles Hartford, am willing to provide sworn testimony regarding criminal conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. I have first-hand knowledge of operations spanning 6 years and involving territorial officials at the highest levels. I request protective custody and formal investigation. You're going to testify using your real name, your real credentials." Jake read her addition with something like awe. "Elizabeth, that makes you a target. Every corrupt..." corrupt official your father's ever paid, every criminal he's ever worked with, they'll all want you silenced. Then you'll have to protect me very well, won't you? Elizabeth managed a smile despite her fear. Besides, I'm not the only witness. We have Billy Garrett's testimony. We have Whitmore in custody. We have physical evidence of the poisoning. I'm just one piece of a larger case. You're the piece that can connect everything together, the daughter who saw it all. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses. Are you sure about this? Once we send this telegram, there's no going back. Elizabeth thought of her father's cold dismissal of her medical ambitions, of Judge Whitmore's cruel plans of the telegram ordering her elimination like she was nothing more than a business problem to be solved. Then she thought of Emma May's fierce loyalty, of Tommy Sullivan's grateful thanks after she'd saved his leg, of an entire town slowly healing because she'd had the knowledge and courage to identify poison instead of disease. She thought of Jake Morrison, who'd chosen to protect instead of exploit, who'd believed in her when he could have dismissed her, who was willing to risk everything to help her fight back. I'm sure, she said firmly. Send the telegram. Jake kissed her, then hard and quick, a promise sealed with desperate certainty before striding off to the telegraph office. Emma May moved to Elizabeth's side, slipping her hand into her mother's. Are we going to be okay? I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to fight like hell to make sure we are. When Marshal Hendricks arrived in Copper Ridge that afternoon with 6 armed men and papers that looked impressively official. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of distinguished appearance that made people trust him instinctively. Elizabeth recognized him immediately from her father's dinner parties. Always polite, always professional, always disappearing into her father's study for private conversations about territorial business. Jake met him in the street outside the sheriff's office, his stance deliberately casual but his hand resting on his gun. Marshal Hendricks, I got your telegram about taking custody of Judge Whitmore. Sheriff Morrison. Hendricks's smile was practiced perfection. I appreciate you holding the prisoner for federal authorities. If you'll just release him to my custody, we can sort out this unfortunate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Jake's voice was flat. The judge deliberately poisoned an entire town's water supply as part of a criminal conspiracy. We have evidence, witnesses, and his own confession. That's not a misunderstanding, that's attempted mass murder. Now, Sheriff, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Judge Whitmore is a respected jurist with an impeccable record. These allegations of criminal activity are likely the result of confusion or Hendricks's eyes found Elizabeth standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office. Malicious testimony from unreliable witnesses. Mrs. Chen is a trained physician who identified arsenic poisoning when everyone else thought it was cholera, Jake replied. Her medical expertise saved lives. I'd say that makes her pretty reliable. Mrs. Chen, Hendricks's tone dripped with false sympathy, or should I say Miss Hartford. Your father is very worried about you. He's authorized me to ensure your safe return to San Francisco where you can receive proper care for your condition. Elizabeth stepped forward, her spine straight, her voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. I don't have a condition, Marshal Hendricks. What I have is firsthand knowledge of my father's criminal enterprises, detailed documentation of bribery and corruption, and a willingness to testify in federal court about everything I've witnessed. Hendricks's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Miss Hartford, you are clearly distraught. The trauma of witnessing violence combined with the stress of living under an assumed identity, it's understandable that you might make accusations you don't fully understand. I understand perfectly. I understand that you've been on my father's payroll for at least 4 years. I understand that you were present at a dinner party in 1885 where my father and Judge Whitmore discussed using Owen Gang to manage territorial complications. I understand that you've helped cover up at least 3 previous incidents of criminal activity connected to Hartford banking syndicate operations. Elizabeth's voice never wavered. And I understand that you're here to make evidence disappear and ensure my father faces no consequences for attempted murder. The street had filled with townspeople drawn by the confrontation. Minors who'd been poisoned, families who'd watched their children sicken, people who'd been saved by Elizabeth's medical intervention and now stood ready to protect her. Hendricks looked around at the hostile crowd and recalculated his approach. Sheriff Morrison, I have federal authority to take custody of Judge Whitmore and to transport Miss Hartford to San Francisco for her own protection. If you interfere, you'll be charged with obstruction of federal law enforcement. And I've got a telegram on its way to Congressman William Bradford in Washington detailing corruption in territorial marshal services and requesting immediate federal intervention. Jake's smile was sharp. So you can threaten all you want, Hendricks, but you're not taking either Whitmore or Elizabeth anywhere. You're making a serious mistake, Sheriff. Probably, but it's my mistake to make. Jake's hand moved closer to his gun. Now you and your men can ride back to Tucson and wait for Bradford's investigators to arrive. Or we can have a problem right here in the street. Your choice. The standoff stretched for long seconds, tension crackling in the desert air. Then Hendricks smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Very well, Sheriff. We'll return to Tucson. But I'll be sending word to Charles Hartford that his daughter is being held against her will by a small-town sheriff with delusions of authority. I'm sure he'll find that interesting. He mounted his horse and gestured for his men to follow. But before riding out, he looked directly at Elizabeth. Your father asked me to give you a message, Miss Hartford. He said to remind you about your mother's jewelry, specifically the pieces she left you in her will. He said you'd understand what that means. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's jewelry. The pieces her mother had specifically left to her with instructions that they be kept safe and never sold. The pieces Elizabeth had hidden in a bank vault in Denver before coming to Copper Ridge, thinking they'd be her emergency funds if she ever needed to run again. Her father was telling her he knew exactly where she'd hidden her only remaining assets. He could seize them, destroy them, use them as leverage. Hendricks saw the recognition in her face and smiled. I thought you might. He also wanted you to know that the bank manager in Denver is a longtime associate, very cooperative when properly motivated. Then he rode out, leaving Elizabeth standing in the dusty street with the sick realization that her father's reach was even longer than she'd feared. Jake was at her side immediately. What was that about? My mother's jewelry. It's all I have left of her, the only things my father couldn't control because she left them to me in a legal will. I hid them in Denver, thought they'd be safe. Elizabeth's voice shook. He's telling me he can take even that there's nowhere I can hide anything from him. He's trying to intimidate you, make you feel helpless. Jake's voice was steady. Elizabeth, look at me. Your father's empire is built on fear and corruption. The moment people stop being afraid, the moment officials stop accepting bribes, his whole operation collapses. He knows that. That's why he's threatening you, trying to make you give up. What if he's right? What if his connections are so deep that even Bradford can't touch him? Then we'll find another way. Jake pulled her close, heedless of the watching townspeople. But we don't give up. You don't go back to San Francisco, you don't surrender, and you sure as hell don't let him make you feel powerless. Emma May appeared at Elizabeth's other side, her young face set with determination. Mother, I've been thinking, if your father knows about the jewelry in Denver, that means he's been tracking your movements, right? Trying to figure out where you went after San Francisco. Probably. So he must have people in lots of places watching for you, banks, telegraph offices, maybe even post offices. Emma May's gray eyes were sharp with intelligence. But Mother, that means we can use that against him. We can send false information, make him think you're somewhere you're not, draw his attention away from what we're really doing. Elizabeth stared at her daughter, this brilliant, brave girl who thought like a strategist, despite being only 10 years old. Emma May, that's actually brilliant. It's basic misdirection. You taught me about it when you were explaining how to distract patients from painful procedures. Emma May smiled. We make your father look in the wrong direction while we gather evidence in Copper Ridge. Jake's expression turned thoughtful. The girl's right. If we can convince Hartford that you've left Copper Ridge, maybe headed back east or further west, he'll pull resources away from here. That gives us breathing room to build our case. How do we convince him I've left? We stage your departure, make it visible, make it dramatic. Jake was already thinking through logistics. You take the eastbound stage tomorrow morning with luggage and everything, but you only ride as far as the next town, then double back cross country and come back to Copper Ridge through the old mining trails. Anyone watching will report that you've left, and Hartford will focus his attention elsewhere. while I stay here and continue gathering evidence. Exactly, but Elizabeth, Jake's voice turned serious. You'll have to stay hidden once you come back. No more treating patients in public, no more visible presence. That's going to be hard. Elizabeth thought of the hospital ward full of recovering arsenic victims, of patients who'd come to trust her medical expertise, of the life she'd been building in Copper Ridge. But she thought harder about her father's threats, about Judge Whitmore's casual discussion of her murder, about the fact that staying visible meant putting everyone around her at risk. I can do it, she decided. I'll stay hidden, work behind the scenes, let Doc Jensen be the public face of medical treatment. As long as I can still help people, I can handle not being visible. That's my girl. Jake kissed her forehead. Now let's plan this carefully. We've got one chance to make it convincing. The next morning, Elizabeth stood in the street beside the eastbound stage. 3 large bags of luggage stacked beside her, saying loud goodbyes to people who'd been coached on exactly what to say. I hate to see you go, Mrs. Chen, Mayor Hawkins said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. But I understand you need to get your daughter back east for proper schooling. MMA deserves opportunities I can't provide here, Elizabeth replied, her voice projecting perfectly. She played enough roles in the past months, widow herbalist physician, that acting one more part came easily. We'll miss Copper Ridge, but sometimes a mother has to make hard choices. MMA stood beside her looking appropriately solemn, clutching a carpet bag that contained nothing but old clothes and books. The girl was a natural actress, Elizabeth had discovered, able to project innocent sadness, while her sharp eyes cataloged every face in the crowd, looking for anyone who seemed too interested, too focused. There, MMA whispered, man in the brown coat watching from the hotel porch. He's not from town. Elizabeth glanced casually in that direction and spotted him, nondescript, forgettable. Exactly the kind of man you'd hire to watch someone without drawing attention. One of her father's agents, undoubtedly. Good. Let him report that Elizabeth Hartford had left Copper Ridge with her daughter, heading east toward civilization. Jake approached with professional courtesy, shaking Elizabeth's hand formally. Safe travels, Mrs. Chen, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Thank you, Sheriff Morrison, for everything. Elizabeth held his hand a moment longer than necessary, feeling the calluses against her palm, memorizing the warmth of his touch. This was goodbye as far as anyone watching was concerned. In reality, it was just the beginning. Elizabeth and MMA climbed into the stage, their luggage loaded on top, and the driver cracked his whip. The horses moved forward, pulling them away from Copper Ridge, away from the life they'd built. The man in the brown coat watched them go, then immediately headed for the telegraph office. Inside the stage, MMA grinned at her mother. That was exciting. Do you think we fooled him? I think we gave a very convincing performance. Elizabeth returned the smile. Now comes the hard part, actually getting back to Copper Ridge without being seen. They rode for 3 hours until the stage reached Redemption Creek, a small way station where Jake had arranged for horses to be waiting. The stage driver, a man Jake trusted, completely helped them unload their luggage, which would continue east and hopefully draw any pursuit away from Copper Ridge. Then Elizabeth and MMA mounted their horses and headed cross-country, following trails that Jake had mapped out in careful detail. It took 6 hours of hard riding through rough terrain, but they finally arrived back at Copper Ridge well after dark, entering through the old mining trails that avoided the main road entirely. Jake was waiting for them at a small cabin on the outskirts of town, an abandoned prospector's claim that he'd hastily cleaned and stocked with supplies. Welcome to your new home, he said as he helped them dismount. It's not much, but it's isolated enough that no one will spot you if you're careful. Elizabeth looked at the rough cabin, one-room basic furniture windows that would need covering to avoid showing lamplight. It was a far cry from her father's San Francisco mansion, or even her small house in Copper Ridge proper. But it was safe. That counted for everything. It's perfect, she said. How long do we need to stay hidden? Bradford's telegram came back this afternoon. He's sending federal investigators, real ones from Washington with no territorial connections. They'll arrive in 5 days. Jake's expression was cautiously hopeful. If we can hold out that long, keep you safe, and keep Whitmore in custody, we've got a real chance at bringing down your father's preparation. 5 days. It seemed both impossibly long and frighteningly short. We can do 5 days, Elizabeth decided. MMA and I will stay here, stay quiet. You can bring us any medical emergencies that need my expertise, but otherwise we're ghosts. What about food supplies? MMA asked practically. I'll bring everything you need, and I'll visit every evening after dark to check on you and update you on what's happening in town. Jake paused. Elizabeth, there's something else. Billy Garrett, the Owen gang member who testified he's been talking more, says he knows where the gang keeps their records, including documentation of every payment they've received from your father. Elizabeth's heart raced. That's exactly the kind of evidence we need. Where are these records? Owen's Ranch, about 30 miles north of here. Well-defended, heavily guarded. Jake's voice was grim. Getting in there would require a significant operation, probably involving federal marshals with proper authority, or a small team that could get in quietly without raising alarms. Elizabeth saw where this was going. Jake, you're thinking about stealing those records before Bradford's investigators arrive. I'm thinking it would be a lot easier to convince federal investigators to pursue a case if we handed them complete documentation of your father's criminal enterprise. Jake met her eyes. But it would be dangerous, the kind of operation where people could get killed. Then we make sure we plan it carefully, minimize risk, and only take people we absolutely trust. Elizabeth's voice was firm. When do we go? Elizabeth, you're not coming on a raid of an outlaw stronghold. The hell I'm not. I know my father's business practices, his accounting methods, what kind of documentation he'd require for illegal transactions. You need me to identify the right records quickly or you'll waste time searching and increase the risk of being caught. Elizabeth crossed her arms. Besides, I'm tired of hiding while other people fight my battles. This is my fight, Jake. Let me be part of it. She's right, Imba May piped up. Mother's good at finding things and organizing information. She'd be useful. You're 10. You don't get a vote. Jake's voice was firm, but Elizabeth could see him wavering. MMA, you'd stay here somewhere, safe with Doc Jensen to look after you. I want to help. No. Elizabeth's tone brooked no argument. Sweetheart, I know you're brave and smart and capable, but this is too dangerous. If something happens to me, you need to be safe somewhere. You can have a future. That's not negotiable. MMA looked mutinous but nodded reluctantly. Fine, but you have to promise you'll come back. I promise, Elizabeth hugged her daughter fiercely. I didn't survive running from my father, poisoning attempts, and corrupt judges just to get killed stealing documents from outlaws. I'm too stubborn for that. Jake ran a hand through his hair, clearly fighting an internal battle between protecting Elizabeth and accepting that she had a right to fight her own battles. Fine, you can come. But you follow my orders exactly. You stay behind me at all times, and at the first sign of real trouble, you run. Understood? Understood. I must be insane, Jake muttered. Planning a raid on an outlaw ranch with a physician who's supposed to be in hiding. What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Wishquam. They assembled the team carefully. Jake, Elizabeth, Tommy Sullivan, whose healed leg had made him fiercely loyal to the woman who'd saved it, and two other trusted deputies who'd proven themselves during the confrontation with Whitmore. Billy Garrett drew them detailed maps of Owen's ranch marking guard positions, the location of the main house where records were kept, and the best approach routes. Owen keeps everything in a safe in his office. Billy explained to his shoulder wound still healing, but his voice clear. He's paranoid about having evidence, says if anyone tries to arrest him, he'll use the records to bring down everyone involved. Mutually assured destruction. How do we open the safe? Jake asked. I know the combination. Owen made me memorize it in case something happened to him. Billy's expression was grim. He trusts family even when he shouldn't. They planned to go in at dawn when guards would be tired and less alert. Quick entry, locate the safe, take the records, get out before Owen's gang realized what was happening. Simple. Clean. Nothing could go wrong. Elizabeth should have known better than to believe in simple plans. They approached Owen's ranch in the pre-dawn darkness, 5 riders moving quietly through scrub brush and rocky terrain. The ranch house was exactly where Billy had described a sprawling structure that had clearly been built with stolen money guards posted at intervals around the perimeter. Too many guards, more than Billy had indicated. Jake held up a hand, stopping their advance. Something's wrong. Billy said 4 guards, maximum. I count at least 8. Maybe Owen increased security after Whitmore's arrest, Elizabeth whispered. Or maybe someone warned him we were coming. Jake's voice was tight with suspicion. We should abort comeback when the sound of a gun being cocked cut him off. Too late for that, Sheriff Morrison. They turned to find themselves surrounded by Owen gang members, at least 15 armed men emerging from cover positions all around them. And in the center of the group, looking entirely too satisfied, stood Marshal Hendricks. I really should thank you, Hendricks said pleasantly. When Hartford asked me to set a trap, wasn't sure you'd be foolish enough to actually walk into it. But here you are attempting to break into private property with clear criminal intent. Elizabeth's stomach dropped to her boots. You knew we were coming. Of course we knew. Your little friend Billy Garrett has been working for us since the day he confessed to you. Hendricks smiled. All that information about records and safe combinations bait Miss Hartford, designed to draw you out of hiding so we could deal with you properly. Billy stepped forward from the group of outlaws, his expression apologetic, but not particularly regretful. Sorry, ma'am, but $500 is $500. And Owen promised he wouldn't kill you, just take you back to your father. Owen lied, Elizabeth said flatly. My father's orders were explicit, terminate with extreme prejudice. You sold me out for money you'll never see because I'll be dead and you'll be next. Billy's face went pale as he realized she was probably right. Enough talk, Hendricks ordered. Disarm them, bind them, and get them secured in the ranch house. Hartford's people will arrive by nightfall to take custody of his wayward daughter. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Elizabeth grabbed his wrist. They were outnumbered 3-1, surrounded with no cover. Drawing would just get them all killed immediately. Don't, she whispered. Not yet. Jake looked at her, something passing between them. Understanding trust, the silent communication of people who'd learned to read each other, he slowly raised his hands in surrender. They were disarmed, bound, and marched into the ranch house, a structure that was much larger inside than its exterior suggested. Owen Garrett clearly believed in living well on stolen money. The outlaw leader himself appeared as they were being secured in what looked like a dining room. Owen was exactly as Elizabeth had pictured from her father's descriptions, red-haired, scarred, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested violence came easily to him. So you're Charles Hartford's troublesome daughter, Owen said, studying Elizabeth like she was a curious specimen. I can see why he wants you back. You've got his eyes smart, calculating, always looking for angles. I'm nothing like my father. Sure you are. You're just using your brains to oppose him instead of working with him. That makes you dangerous, not different. Owen turned to Hendricks. Hartford's people aren't arriving until nightfall. What am I supposed to do with them until then? Keep them secured and alive. Hartford wants his daughter breathing so he can deal with her personally. Hendricks checked his pocket watch. I'm heading back to Tucson to file reports about the sheriff's tragic attempt to raid an innocent rancher's property. When Hartford arrives, everything will be properly documented and legally justified. And the others? Owen gestured to Jake and the deputies. Unfortunate casualties of a criminal enterprise. No one will question it. Hendricks tipped his hat mockingly at Elizabeth. I really am sorry it had to end this way, Miss Hartford. You seem like a bright young woman, but your father pays very well, and loyalty to employers is important in my line of work. After Hendricks left, Owen posted guards and disappeared to deal with ranch business, leaving Elizabeth, Jake, Tommy Sullivan, and the 2 deputies bound and under watch in the dining room. I'm sorry, Elizabeth whispered to Jake. This is my fault. I insisted on coming, and now we're all going to die because of it. This is your father's fault, not yours. Jake's voice was low but fierce. And we're not dead yet. Where there's life, there's a chance to escape. We're bound, guarded, and outnumbered. What chance do we have? I don't know yet, but I've gotten out of worse situations. Jake managed a grim smile. Trust me, with my life, apparently literally at this point. They sat in tense silence for hours, watching guards change position, studying the room for potential weapons or escape routes. Elizabeth's medical training kept her focused on details, the way the ropes were tied, whether they were tight enough to restrict blood flow, how long they could stay bound before serious injury occurred. She was cataloging symptoms of potential nerve damage when Emma May's voice came from outside the window. Mother, are you in there? Elizabeth's heart stopped. Emma May was supposed to be safe in Copper Ridge with Doc Jensen. She was supposed to be nowhere near this deadly situation. Emma May, run, Elizabeth hissed. Get away from here right now. I can't. I followed you because I knew something would go wrong and I was right. The girl's voice was calm, practical. Also, I brought help. What help, Emma May? There is 15 armed outlaws here. I know, I counted them. But mother, I sent a telegram to someone before I left Copper Ridge. Someone I thought might want to help. Before Elizabeth could ask who, the sound of approaching horses filled the air, lots of horses moving fast. Owen burst into the dining room, his face twisted with fury. Who sent for federal marshals? Someone's betrayed us. But it wasn't federal marshals who rode into the ranch yard. It was Charles Hartford himself, accompanied by a private army of at least 20 men. Elizabeth's father dismounted with practiced elegance, his expensive suit somehow remaining pristine despite the desert journey. He looked exactly as she remembered: silver hair, cold gray eyes, the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Owen strode out to meet him. Hartford, what the hell are you doing here? Hendricks said you weren't arriving until nightfall. Plans changed when I received a telegram from a child claiming my daughter was in mortal danger and requesting my immediate assistance. Charles Hartford's voice carried the same cold precision Elizabeth remembered from childhood disappointments and dismissed dreams. Imagine my surprise to discover that child was correct. My daughter is indeed here, bound and held captive by the criminal organization I've been financing. Owen's face went white. Now, Hartford, this is just a misunderstanding. Is it because it looks very much like you've kidnapped my daughter with intent to harm her? Charles's voice never rose, but somehow it filled the space with threat. That's a serious breach of our business arrangement, Mr. Garrett. Your orders said to capture her, to bring her back to San Francisco by any means necessary. My orders said no such thing. Charles pulled a telegram from his pocket and read aloud, locate my daughter. Ensure her safety. Report her location immediately. Do not approach or threaten her under any circumstances. Those were my explicit instructions, Mr. Garrett. Which part of do not approach or threaten was unclear. Elizabeth listened to this exchange with growing confusion. Her father had ordered her capture, her elimination. She'd seen the telegram, read his words. Unless that telegram had been falsified. Unless someone had been giving Owen Garrett and Judge Whitmore orders that weren't actually coming from Charles Hartford. Hendricks, she breathed. Hendricks was playing both sides, manipulating everyone. Jake, bound beside her, had reached the same conclusion. He made your father think Owen was following orders, while telling Owen that Hartford wanted you dead. That way, when you were killed, Hendricks could blame Owen, eliminate a witness, and collect payment from both sides. But who sent the telegram to my father? Elizabeth looked toward the window where Emma May's voice had come from. Emma May, did you? I found your father's address in your medical journals, Mother. The ones where you'd written his name and crossed it out lots of times. Emma May's voice carried a mix of pride and nervousness. I thought maybe if he knew you were really in danger, he might help. I know you said he was bad, but I thought maybe he just didn't understand what was happening. Charles Hartford had entered the dining room during this exchange. He stopped short when he saw Elizabeth bound to a chair. Her face bruised from rough handling, her medical skills and independence reduced to helpless captivity. Something passed across his face, shock, perhaps, or anger, or something that might have been regret if Elizabeth didn't know better. Release her, he ordered Owen's men. Now. But Hartford, now, or I withdraw all financial support from your operations, contact every federal marshal in 3 territories, and ensure you spend the rest of your life in prison. Charles's voice was arctic. Your choice, Mr. Garrett. The outlaws moved to obey, cutting Elizabeth and the others free. Jake immediately moved to her side, positioning himself between her and any potential threat. Charles watched this with calculating eyes. Sheriff Morrison, I presume. The man who's been protecting my daughter and investigating my business operations. That's right. Jake's hand rested on his gun. And I'm not letting you take her back to San Francisco if she doesn't want to go. I wouldn't dream of it. My daughter has made her preferences quite clear. Charles turned to Elizabeth, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, privately. Anything you say to her, you can say in front of me, Jake said firmly. No. Elizabeth put a hand on Jake's arm. It's all right. I need to hear what my father has to say. Elizabeth, I'll be fine. And if I'm not, you have my permission to shoot him. She managed a smile despite the tension. "Give me 10 minutes." Jake looked unhappy but nodded, stepping back but keeping his gun ready. Elizabeth followed her father into Owen's office, the room where they'd planned to steal records that apparently didn't contain what they'd thought they would contain. Charles closed the door and turned to face her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The father who'd valued business over family, the daughter who'd chosen freedom over obedience. "I didn't order your death," Charles said finally. "I need you to know that, Elizabeth. Whatever you've been told, whatever evidence you've seen, I never gave orders to have you eliminated. I saw a telegram, your words, your signature, forged clearly by someone who wanted us both to believe I'd betrayed you." Charles moved to the desk, pulling out documents with practiced efficiency. "I've been investigating inconsistencies in my business accounts for 6 months. Money disappearing, orders being given in my name without my knowledge, associates acting on instructions I never gave. It's why I agreed to finance the Copper Ridge mining operation, not because I wanted to poison innocent people, but because I wanted to catch whoever was embezzling from Hartford banking and using my reputation to cover criminal activities." Elizabeth stared at her father, trying to reconcile this explanation with everything she'd believed for months. "You're saying you were investigating your own criminal enterprise. I'm saying I was investigating an enterprise I didn't know I had. Elizabeth, I'm not a good man. I've bent rules, influenced politicians, made questionable business decisions in pursuit of profit. But I'm not a murderer, and I don't poison mining towns." Charles's voice carried conviction. "Someone's been using my name, my money, my connections, and I need to know who." "Hendricks," Elizabeth said slowly. "He had access to your accounts, your correspondence. As a federal marshal, he could move money, send telegrams, give orders, and everyone would assume it was legitimate because he worked for you. But why? What does he gain from embezzling from me while committing crimes in my name? Power, money, the ability to build his own criminal empire while using your reputation as cover." Elizabeth's mind was racing through implications. "Father, if Hendricks has been operating independently, if he's built connections with outlaws and corrupt judges, while everyone believed he was working for you, then I'm the perfect scapegoat when everything collapses. He destroys my reputation, seizes my assets through legal mechanisms, and emerges as the heroic marshal who brought down Charles Hartford's criminal empire." Charles's expression hardened. "Brilliant, actually. Ruthless, but brilliant. We need to prove it. We need evidence that Hendricks was acting independently. I have some. Bank records that don't match my ledger's telegrams. I never sent deposits to accounts I didn't authorize." Charles gestured to the documents on the desk. "It's not complete, but combined with testimony from people he's manipulated, like Judge Whitmore, like Owen Garrett, like me." Elizabeth felt pieces clicking into place. "Father, if we pool our evidence, if we work together, we can destroy Hendricks completely and clear both our names." Charles looked at her directly. "Elizabeth, I know I failed you as a father. I prioritized business over your happiness, dismissed your medical ambitions as foolish, tried to arrange your marriage without considering your wishes. I was wrong about all of that. Yes, you were. But I never wanted you dead. I never wanted you harmed. When I discovered you disappeared, when I realized someone had made you so afraid that you'd fake your own death to escape." Charles' voice roughened with something that might have been genuine emotion. "I sent investigators to find you, yes, but only to ensure your safety, to bring you home if you wanted to come, to make certain you weren't in danger. The reward notice was falsified. I never offered $5,000 for your return. That was Hendricks using my name, trying to draw you out of hiding so he could eliminate the one person who'd seen documents in my study that would prove his embezzlement." Elizabeth wanted to disbelieve him. It would be easier, simpler to maintain the clear narrative where her father was the villain and she was the heroic victim. But the evidence was making more sense this way. The inconsistencies in how different people described her father's orders. The way Hendricks always seemed to be present at critical moments, manipulating situations. The telegram that had ordered her death, she'd never actually verified the signature. Had she just assumed it came from her father? Because that's what Hendricks had claimed. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Father, even if you're telling the truth about Hendricks, That doesn't erase years of you controlling my life, dismissing my dreams, treating me like property to be managed rather than a person to be respected. No, it doesn't. And I don't expect forgiveness. Charles's voice was quiet. But Elizabeth, I'm proud of you. Genuinely proud. You became a physician despite every obstacle I put in your way. You saved lives, built a new identity, protected people who needed protection. You're everything I never taught you to be, and you're better for it. The words hit harder than Elizabeth expected. She'd spent her whole life wanting her father's approval, his recognition, his pride in her accomplishments. Hearing it now in this unlikely moment felt both validating and infuriating. I don't need your approval anymore, she said firmly. I've built a life here, Father. I have a daughter. I've adopted a man I love, a community that values my medical skills. I'm not coming back to San Francisco. I wouldn't ask you to. In fact, Charles pulled another document from his desk. I've had my lawyers prepare this. Full release from any family obligations, legal recognition of your medical degree, and transfer of your mother's entire estate to your sole ownership. You'll have financial independence, legal autonomy, and my complete support for whatever life you choose to build. Elizabeth took the document with shaking hands. It was everything she'd wanted, wrapped up in legal language that made it real and binding. Why, she asked. Why give me all this now? Because I finally understand what your mother tried to tell me before she died, that you're not property to be managed or a chess piece to be positioned. You're my daughter, and you deserve the freedom to be whoever you choose to be. Charles managed a small smile. Even if that means being a frontier doctor, married to a small-town sheriff, raising an adopted daughter in Arizona territory. I haven't said yes to Jake's proposal yet, but you will. I saw how he looks at you like you're the most valuable thing in his world. And I saw how you look at him like he's home. Charles's expression turned wistful. Your mother used to look at me that way before I became too focused on business to notice. A commotion outside interrupted them, shouting the sound of horses' gunfire. Jake burst through the door. Hendricks is back with federal marshals, real ones, from Bradford's office. He's claiming Owen kidnapped you, that your father was complicit, and he's here to restore order. Of course he is, Charles said grimly. He's making his play to destroy me and claim credit for rescuing you. Then we counter his narrative with truth. Elizabeth grabbed the documents her father had shown her. We have evidence of his embezzlement. He was giving orders in your name. Combined with testimony from Owen Whitmore and me, it might not be enough if his marshals are willing to follow his orders without question, Jake warned. Then we make sure they question. Elizabeth moved toward the door with newfound determination. It's time to stop hiding, stop running, and start fighting back with everything we have. They emerged from the office to find Owen's ranch yard full of armed men, Owen's gang on one side, Hendricks's marshals on the other, Charles Hartford's private security force in the middle, and federal investigators from Bradford's office trying to restore order. Marshal Hendricks stood at the center of it all, looking supremely confident. Charles Hartford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of federal officials, and operating a criminal enterprise. Elizabeth Hartford, you're being taken into protective custody for your own safety. On whose authority? One of Bradford's investigators demanded. He was young, sharp-eyed, with the kind of intensity that suggested he took his job seriously. On my authority as senior federal marshal in this territory, Hendricks replied smoothly. Actually, your authority was suspended 3 hours ago. The investigator pulled out official documents. Congressman Bradford received evidence of corruption in territorial marshal services. You've been relieved of duty pending investigation, Marshal Hendricks. Or should I say former Marshal Hendricks? Hendricks's confident expression cracked. That's impossible. I've done nothing wrong. You've been embezzling from Charles Hartford for at least 4 years, giving criminal orders in his name and manipulating multiple investigations to cover your tracks. The investigator gestured to his colleagues. We have bank records, testimony from court clerks, and a very detailed statement from Judge Whitmore about your involvement in the Copper Ridge poisoning scheme. Whitmore is lying to save himself. Maybe, but he's corroborating testimony from Owen Garrett, Billy Garrett, and several other witnesses. The investigator's voice was steel. Thomas Hendricks, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corruption of federal office, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 15 other charges we're still cataloging. What followed was chaos: Hendricks being arrested, Owen and his gang being taken into custody, federal investigators trying to sort through competing claims and testimonies. Through it all, Elizabeth stood beside Jake and her father, the three of them presenting a united front as they gave detailed statements about Hendricks's crimes. It took hours. The sun climbed toward noon, then began its descent toward evening. Emma May appeared from wherever she'd been hiding, immediately attaching herself to Elizabeth's side and refusing to be separated. Finally, Bradford's lead investigator, a man named Coleman, approached them with exhaustion clear on his face. "All right, here's how this is going to work," he said. "Hendricks is going to federal prison for a very long time. Owen Garrett and his gang are being charged with multiple crimes, including the Copper Ridge poisoning. Judge Whitmore is already in custody and will face additional charges based on today's revelations." "And my father?" Elizabeth asked. Coleman looked at Charles Hartford with complicated expression. "Mr. Hartford, you've engaged in questionable business practices, bribed local officials, and bent more laws than I can count. Under normal circumstances, you'd be facing charges." But Charles's voice was calm. "But you were also the victim of a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. You cooperated fully with our investigation, and frankly, Congressman Bradford thinks putting you in prison would be a waste of resources when you could be more useful helping us dismantle other criminal operations in the Western Territories." Coleman pulled out documents. "You're going to pay substantial fines, make restitution to everyone affected by your business practices, and cooperate with ongoing federal investigations. In exchange, we won't file criminal charges." Charles nodded slowly. "That seems more than fair. Don't get comfortable. If you step out of line even once, this deal evaporates and you go to prison." Coleman turned to Elizabeth. "Dr. Hartford, you are free to go. No charges, no outstanding warrants. Your testimony has been invaluable, and the medical evidence you provided about the arsenic poisoning was crucial to our case." "Thank you." Elizabeth felt tension she'd been carrying for months finally release. "Sheriff Morrison, you exceeded your jurisdiction multiple times during this investigation, engaged in questionable legal practices, and generally operated like you were still a Pinkerton agent instead of a local sheriff." Coleman's expression was stern. "However, you also saved lives, exposed corruption, and protected a witness who proved essential to our investigation. I'm recommending you receive a commendation instead of censure." Jake managed a tired smile. "I'll try to contain my excitement." Coleman looked at Emma May last. "Young lady, you sent a telegram that potentially saved lives and definitely advanced this investigation. That was either very brave or very foolish." "Both," Emma May said simply, "but it worked." "Yes, it did." Coleman's stern expression softened slightly. "Your mother, your adopted mother, should be proud of you." "She is," Elizabeth confirmed, pulling Emma May close. "Though we're going to have a long conversation about following dangerous criminals and sending telegrams to my estranged father without permission. But after that conversation, I don't get punished because I helped solve the case, right?" Emma May's voice was hopeful. "We'll see." As federal investigators began the long process of sorting through evidence and processing prisoners, Charles Hartford approached Elizabeth one final time. "I meant what I said about your independence, Elizabeth. You're free to build whatever life you choose." He paused. "Though I hope that life might include occasional correspondence with your father. I'd like to know my granddaughter, adopted or not, and perhaps repair some of what I've broken between us." Elizabeth looked at the man who'd failed her in so many ways, but had ultimately chosen to help when it mattered most. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily or quickly, but maybe with time and effort from both sides, they could build something better than what they'd had. "Write to me," she said. "I can't promise more than that right now, but I'm willing to try." "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." Charles looked at Jake. "Sheriff Morrison, I trust you'll take care of my daughter." "With my life," Jake replied without hesitation. "Good, because if you hurt her, I still have enough connections to make your life extremely difficult." Charles's smile took the sting from the threat. Consider that fair warning from a soon-to-be father-in-law. After Charles departed with his security force, after the federal investigators had taken custody of all the prisoners, after the chaos had finally subsided into something approaching normalcy, Elizabeth found herself standing in Owen's ranch yard with Jake and Emma May, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert. "So," Jake said quietly, "what now?" "Now we go home to Copper Ridge." Elizabeth leaned into his solid warmth. I resumed practicing medicine openly using my real name and credentials. MMA continues her education. And you and I figure out what this relationship is and where it's going. I know where I want it to go. Jake turned her to face him, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. Elizabeth Hartford, will you marry me? Not because it's practical or strategic or good cover, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Elizabeth looked at the man who'd protected her when he could have exploited her, who'd believed in her when he could have dismissed her, who'd risked everything to help her fight back against corruption and abuse. Yes, she said simply, I'll marry you, Jake Morrison, but fair warning, I'm keeping my medical practice. I'm going to be a very involved mother to Emma May, and I have absolutely no intention of being a conventional sheriff's wife. I wouldn't want you any other way. Jake kissed her thorough and certain, a promise sealed in the desert twilight. Emma May made gagging Sean's patience. Are you two going to be like this all the time now? Because it's very distracting. Yes, they said in unison, then laughed. Come on, Elizabeth said, taking Jake's hand and Emma May's. Let's go home. 6 months later, the sign outside the clinic read, Dr. Elizabeth Hartford Morrison, M.D., General Practice and Surgery. Elizabeth stood in front of it with fierce pride, still not quite believing it was real. Her own medical practice in her own name, serving a community that valued her skills and respected her expertise. The wedding had been small, just friends from Copper Ridge, Doc Jensen officiating Emma May as maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd designed herself. Charles Hartford had sent an extravagant gift and a letter expressing regret that business in San Francisco prevented his attendance. Elizabeth suspected the real reason was giving her space to build her new life without his complicated presence, and she appreciated the discretion. The arsenic victims had all recovered thanks to Elizabeth's correct diagnosis and treatment protocol. Tommy Sullivan now worked as her clinic assistant, his healed leg a testament to her surgical skill. Mrs. Kowalski had delivered a healthy baby girl she'd named Elizabeth in honor of the doctor who'd saved so many lives. Judge Whitmore was serving 20 years in federal prison. Owen Garrett had received a similar sentence. Hendricks was awaiting trial in Washington, facing enough charges to keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. And Charles Hartford, true to his word, had paid substantial fines, made restitution to everyone affected by his business practices, and was now cooperating with federal investigations into territorial corruption. His letters arrived monthly, brief but genuine, documenting his efforts to rebuild his relationship with the daughter he'd nearly lost. Jake appeared in the clinic doorway, his sheriff's badge catching the afternoon sunlight. Ready to go home, Dr. Morrison? Almost. I have one more patient to see. Elizabeth gestured to the examination room where Emma May waited with a book, supposedly reading, but actually eavesdropping on everything happening in the clinic. Is she sick? No, but she's been pestering me about learning to do stitches. I figured it was time to start teaching her proper surgical technique using practice materials. Jake smiled. That girl is going to be a better doctor than both of us combined. I know, and I can't wait to see it. They walked home together. Elizabeth, Jake, and Emma May through streets where people called out greetings and children ran past playing games. Copper Ridge had grown in 6 months. New families arriving, new businesses, opening prosperity, returning now that the poisoning had stopped and justice had been served. At their house, expanded from Jake's bachelor quarters to accommodate a family dinner, waited. Elizabeth had learned to cook adequately, though she'd never matched Jake's skill with frontier cuisine. Emma May had taken over baking, producing bread and pastries that rivaled anything available in San Francisco. They were building a life together. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and chosen and theirs. As they sat down to eat, Emma May cleared her throat. Mother, Father, I have an announcement. Oh. Elizabeth exchanged glances with Jake. I've been thinking about my future, about what I want to do with my medical education. Emma May's voice was serious beyond her years. I want to specialize in pediatrics, children's medicine, because kids who are sick or hurt need doctors who understand them, who remember what it's like to be small and scared. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. That's a wonderful goal, sweetheart. And I know it means more education than just learning from you and Doc Jensen. So I was hoping, Majubi, Emma May pulled out a letter that maybe I could apply to medical school when I'm old enough. There's one in Boston that accepts women students. I wrote to them asking about their program. You wrote to them, oh, Jake's voice was equal parts surprise and pride. I wanted to know if it was possible before I asked you, because I don't want to dream about things that can't happen. Emma May looked between her parents with hope and determination mixed on her young face. Can I, when I'm old enough, can I go to medical school and become a real doctor like mother? Elizabeth crossed to Emma May and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. Yes, absolutely yes. You can be anything you want to be, sweetheart. And your father and I will support you every step of the way, even if it means leaving Copper Ridge. Even then, though I suspect you'll come back afterward ready to bring the best medical care to the place that raised you. Emma May's smile was bright enough to rival the setting sun. I will. I promise. That night, after Emma May had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Elizabeth stood on the porch with Jake watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Do you ever regret it? Jake asked quietly. Giving up your father's wealth, your San Francisco connections, the life you could have had? Never. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace. I gave up a gilded cage in exchange for freedom. I gave up being property in exchange for being a person. I gave up my father's version of my future in exchange for building my own. And what does your future look like? A medical practice that serves people who need it. A daughter who's going to change the world. A husband who stands beside me instead of trying to control me. A community that values what I can do instead of limiting what I'm allowed to be. Elizabeth turned in Jake's arms, looking up at the man who'd chosen to protect instead of exploit. That's not a compromise, Jake. That's everything I ever wanted. Even the part where you're married to a stubborn sheriff with more scars than sense, especially that part. Elizabeth kissed him softly. You gave me back my life when you could have sold me out for reward money. You believed in me when you could have dismissed my medical knowledge as impossible for a woman. You stood beside me when fighting was dangerous and running would have been safer. How could I regret any of that? I love you, Elizabeth Hartford Morrison. I love you too, Jake Morrison, even when you're being overprotective and impossible. I'm not overprotective. You posted guards around the clinic for 3 months after Hendricks was arrested. That was reasonable security precautions. You threatened to shoot a patient who was too friendly during an examination. He was inappropriate. He was 70 years old and mostly deaf. He didn't hear me tell him to move his hand. Elizabeth laughed at the memory. But I appreciate the protective instinct even when it's excessive. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other through danger and deception, who'd built something real from the wreckage of their separate pasts. In the distance, a coyote howled. Closer, the sounds of Copper Ridge settling into evening conversations drifting from open windows, music from the saloon, children being called in for bed. Home. Not the mansion where Elizabeth had grown up feeling invisible and controlled. Not the isolated cabin where she'd hidden in fear. But this place with these people building this life. Thank you, Elizabeth said quietly. For what? For seeing me. The real me beneath the disguises and the fear and the lies I told to survive. For believing I was worth protecting even when you had every reason to doubt me. For loving me despite all the complications I brought into your life. Jake turned her to face him, his expression serious in the starlight. Elizabeth, you didn't bring complications into my life. You brought purpose. Before you arrived, I was going through motions being sheriff because it was a job protecting people, because it was duty. But you reminded me why any of it matters. You showed me that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to defend. Is this the part where you get sentimental and I pretend I'm not crying? This is the part where we both acknowledge that we found each other when we needed it most and we're not letting go. Jake cupped her face in his weathered hands. You're stuck with me, Dr. Morrison. For better or worse, in sickness and health through poisoning investigations and corrupt judges and whatever other chaos your life attracts. Our life, Elizabeth corrected, and I wouldn't have it any other way. From inside the house, Emma May's voice called out, are you two being sentimental on the porch again? Because it's very sweet, but also I'm trying to sleep. They laughed, the sound carrying across the desert night, and went inside to their chosen family, their hard-won peace, their imperfect and beautiful life. Elizabeth Hartford had started this journey running from a father who saw her as property and a judge who wanted to possess her. She'd hidden behind false names, buried her medical training, lived in fear of being discovered, and dragged back to a life she didn't want. But somewhere along the way, running had transformed into fighting. Hiding had become standing her ground. Fear had been replaced with the courage to be exactly who she was, physician, mother, wife, survivor. The road had been dangerous. The cost had been high. But the reward, freedom, love, purpose, a life lived on her own terms, that was worth everything she'd sacrificed to claim it. And as Elizabeth drifted off to sleep that night, nestled safe in Jake's arms with MMA's soft breathing, audible through the walls, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of challenge or conflict, but the deep certainty that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had a family who loved her, a community that valued her, a purpose that fulfilled her. She had survived. More than that, she had triumphed. And that was the best revenge of all against everyone who tried to make her small, silent, and powerless. Elizabeth Hartford Morrison was none of those things. She was exactly who she'd fought to become, and she was finally gloriously free. Thank you for joining Dr. Elizabeth Hartford on her journey from frightened fugitive to fierce frontier physician, from San Francisco society to Arizona freedom, and from her father's control to her own hard-won independence. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones built by family expectations and societal limitations, and that true courage means fighting for the right to define yourself. If you enjoyed this tale of medical mystery, corrupt judges, and a woman who refused to be silenced, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories of strong women who transformed the American frontier through intelligence, determination, and the unwavering belief that they deserve better than what others tried to force upon them. What other frontier stories would you like to see? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and remember, it's never too late to choose freedom over safety, truth over deception, and the life you want over the one others demand you accept. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.